All right, my friends, in these final moments before we begin, I would love to offer a warm welcome for those of you who've been able to join us, and a big thank you to those who've been able to enter their introductions into chat, as well as these words that we've been able to enter into the word cloud. So if you haven't heard yet, please do make sure you have a mobile device or a secondary device nearby throughout the session, as we will be using Mentimeter one last time as the session progresses. Oh, Christine, thank you so much for letting me know. 1452 22 7 is the correct code. Thank you so much for updating that. With that being said, I would love to pass the mic on over to Adam Weber, who will kick us off. Adam, over to you.
Thank you, Janina. And again, welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today as we launch the Development Data Library, or DDL, Roadmap for Education Programs. My name is Adam. I will be facilitating today. Before we get started, I just wanted to bring your attention to a few things. We do have closed captioning available. I believe at the bottom of your screen, if you click on in the toolbox the word more, if you click on more, you should be able to activate those subtitles and activate the closed captioning. I would also like to remind you that we are going to be recording today's session. And also, I would like to also guide you to the chat box. If you have not yet had that open, please go ahead and open up that chat box. You should go ahead and introduce yourself, so your name, your organization, and your position. Just let us know who is with us. And then you should see, just gonna go ahead and turn my video there. You should also see in a moment a link to the DDL roadmap itself. I think Janina or Emma, if we could go ahead and paste that link in so folks can go ahead and open up that roadmap. If you have not yet had a chance to take a look at that roadmap or have it open, go ahead and do so now, because we are going to be referencing it during our session today. So I think with that, if we could go ahead and activate those slides, I think we can go ahead and get started. Great. Okay, so again, welcome everyone for joining us today as we launch the DDL Roadmap for Education Programs. We are going to get started in just a moment. As I mentioned, you can go ahead and activate those closed captioning at the bottom of your screen in the toolbox by clicking on More. We are going to also have some Q&A sessions later on. For the first two mini Q&As, we are going to use that chat box. So if you have not yet had that open, go ahead and open up that chat box and you can submit your questions, typing them directly into the chat box when we get to that point. In terms of acknowledgements, so the DDL roadmap, as well as this presentation, it was prepared for USAID by Encompass LLC and its partner MSI, a Tetra Tech company, for the Data and Evidence for Education Programs, or DEEP contract. So before we get started, I'd like to just introduce our team. So from USAID, we have Chris Ying, who is the Senior Education Data Specialist for the Education Office. And Chris, I'll actually just hand it over to you now for an introduction and some opening remarks.
Thanks, Adam, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of the USAID Office of Education, we welcome you to this webinar on the DDL Roadmap for Education Programs. We're really excited to see the interest in this, and we're hoping that this kicks off an ongoing conversation with USAID and our implementing partners around submission of data to the DDL to make education data sets more available for the education sector at large. I'd like to take a brief moment to thank our colleagues at the DEEP activity for helping us put this together, as well as our colleagues at the USAID Data Services in the Office of the Chief Information Officer, who've helped us kind of put this together, who run the DDL, and who've partnered with us on this. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Adam.
Great, thank you, Chris. So next, I'm very pleased to introduce our colleagues from USAID Data Services. So they have very graciously agreed to participate today to help answer your questions about the DDL. So first, I would like to introduce Morgan Daniels. And if you have your camera activated as I introduce you, just go ahead and give a wave to our participants today. Morgan is the Senior Curator with USAID Data Services. So very warm welcome to Morgan. Next, we have Jelena Knezovich, who is a data librarian with USAID Data Services. So very warm welcome to Jelena for joining us today. And then I believe we also, I'm not sure if Erica has joined us yet, but we also hopefully will have Erica Hawkins joining us for the Q&A. Erica is a legal expert with data privacy with the USAID Data Services team. And I believe she is not yet in the room, but hopefully she'll be able to join us in a bit when we get to those Q&A sessions. So again, many thanks to our colleagues from USAID for joining us today. Next, I would like to introduce the DEEP team. So we have Janina Acevedo Yates, who is a learning specialist with Encompass, and she is producing our session today. So welcome to Janina. And we also have Emma Venetes, who is a project coordinator also with Encompass and also helping to produce our session today. So welcome to Emma. And then finally myself, as I mentioned, my name is Adam. I am a technical manager with MSI and I will be facilitating today. So next, before we get started, I'm wondering if we could revisit that word cloud, because I noticed quite a bit of folks were submitting their responses. So we could just take a look. So confusing, so that definitely pops up. Limited, frustrating, stressful. So that's good to know. Hopefully after today's session, the DDL, kind of the process of submitting data to the DDL will be a little bit less confusing and less frustrating. So hopefully the session today will be useful. So let's see, next I would like to go ahead and talk a little bit about yourselves. So I believe when everyone registered, there was a question on the form, how much experience do you have submitting data to the DDL? And you can see in the pie charts, quite a bit of folks do not yet have any experience or they're working on their very first submission. But we actually have quite a diverse group in terms of experience because some of you have quite a bit of experience as well. So hopefully today's session will be helpful for everyone. Those who don't have much experience, those that do, hopefully this will be a useful experience for everyone. And also the roadmap will be a helpful tool for everyone as well. So next, I'm going to go ahead and just share our agenda for today and some room rules. So in terms of the agenda, in just a moment, I'm going to hand it over to Janina, who is going to present a brief video to introduce the DDL roadmap. We're then going to have what I hope is kind of a fun and interactive session where we kind of present a couple of topics from the roadmap, and then we actually give you an open book quiz where we're going to give you a couple of questions, and then you can go ahead and look through the roadmap for the answer. So again, if you don't have that roadmap open, go ahead and open it up. I believe the link was posted in the chat box, and you can also find it on EduLinks because you will be able to use that during the open book quiz. Following the quiz, we'll have a couple of short mini Q&As to answer questions about the particular topics that we present. We'll then take a quick water break, and that will be followed by the main Q&A session where we will open up the floor to any and all questions related to the DDL, any topics, and hopefully we can answer them all. And we will then close with a brief activity. In terms of the room rules, we do ask that everyone please keep yourself muted. I believe we have around 80 people registered. Already we have over 50 participants. So we have quite a lot of folks joining us today. So just to help things run smoothly, please go ahead and keep yourself muted. In terms of the Q&As, so as I mentioned, when we get to the open book quiz, we will have a couple of mini Q&As. And for those, when we get to that point, you can submit your questions using the chat box feature. Following the break, when we get to the main Q&A, we'll actually be using a little bit of a different format where we're going to share a link and you can follow that link to submit questions. But I'll explain that in more detail when we get to that point. And with that, I will turn it back over to Janina to share our video.
Thanks, Adam. So in just a few minutes, you will see your screen shift and you'll be taken to a new image with the video on the screen. If you do have any difficulty accessing the video, I do ask that my colleague Emma please paste the link into chat so that you may be able to access directly from there. With that, we will take you now to our video.
The DDL Roadmap for Education Programs is designed to help USAID partners in education fulfill their contractual obligation to submit to the Development Data Library, or DDL. Beyond covering the requirements for submission, the roadmap offers guidance to make sure your data are of a sufficient quality to be discoverable and useful. This short video is an introduction to the roadmap and is intended to help supplement your journey. You may interact with the roadmap by clicking on the interactive icons or by scrolling as you would any other online resource. This table of contents serves as the foundation for the roadmap. As such, anytime you see a home icon throughout the guide, you will be redirected back to this page. Here, depending on which section you desire to direct to, you can click on the title. On this page, you will also find the roadside legend. This legend explains what the different road signs placed throughout the roadmap mean. For example, the stop sign indicates an article discusses a critical part of DDL submission. The green light indicates a best practice that will strengthen your submission. The table of contents also includes the link legend, which explains the different types of links in the roadmap. The roadmap often uses links to articles and videos in the DDL user guide. This resource, which you can find on the DDL website, is aimed at broader audiences of all DDL users and submitters. The parts of the roadmap that link to the DDL user guide are marked with the heading Explore the DDL user guide online. The roadmap starts by explaining why submitting data to the DDL matters. So why does it? Well, USAID considers data a public good that should be shared with a global audience while safeguarding privacy, security, and confidentiality. By submitting high-quality data to the DDL, you can help fuel innovation, drive good practice, and brighten the future for the next generation of learners. On this page, you will see 3 icons that explain how your DDL submission will support these goals. You will find these icons next to different articles throughout the roadmap. The Showcase Your Impact icon indicates an article contains guidance on how to successfully submit to the DDL so that others can discover and use your data. The Make Your Data Meaningful icon indicates an article contains guidance on how to strengthen the quality of your data so that others can draw valid conclusions from them. And finally, the Protect the Communities You Serve icon indicates an article contains guidance on how to respect the rights and privacy of program beneficiaries through informed consent and safeguarding personally identifiable information. With that, feel free to open the roadmap and start exploring. If you do have any questions as you are navigating the DDL roadmap, you may contact Chris Ying at cying@usaid.gov or Adam Weber, adam.weber, W-E-B-E-R, at msi-inc.com. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Best of luck to you as you produce, clean, and upload high-quality data onto the DDL.
Okay. Thank you so much, Janina, for that video. Hopefully that was useful to everyone. So we're now going to move on to this open book quiz, which again we hope is kind of a fun and interactive way to start exploring some of the topics in the roadmap. So the way this is going to work is in just a moment, we're going to present a couple of topics from the roadmap. And then we will then give you some quiz questions. And to answer those quiz questions, you can actually open up the roadmap. We'll give you a few moments to look through the roadmap for the answer. So if you have not yet have that roadmap open, you should see the link to it in the chat box. Just go ahead and have that roadmap open so you can use it during the quiz. And also, if you do have a secondary device nearby, that might be helpful. When you submit answers, we're going to be using the Mentimeter again, just like for the word cloud. So it might be helpful to submit your answer on your mobile device. You can also submit it on your computer as well, if you did that for the word cloud as well. So that's not a problem. And with that, I think we will go ahead and move on to our first topic, which is getting consent from participants. So as I'm sure everyone here knows, when you are collecting data that involves human subjects, which it often does in the education sector, it's very important that you get consent from the people that you are collecting data from. So what we mean by informed consent is that you give participants the information they need to make an informed decision about whether to participate in your data collection activity. So just some points here in terms of vocabulary. When we're talking about getting approval to participate from adults, we use the term informed consent. When we talk about getting approval from participants who are children to getting approval from children to participate in your activity, since children are younger than the age of consent and they are not legally able to give consent, we use the term informed assent. So any questions you have about when you need to get informed consent or informed assent, what to include in your consent statement, you can actually find that, that information in the Code of Federal Regulations. Specifically, the section from USAID is section 225.116. And we actually we talk about that in more detail in the roadmap, and we link to the code there as well. But that's where you should go for questions that you may have about getting consent for your data collection activity. Now, the reason why we are talking about it here in this session is because when you are submitting data to the DDL, and that data comes from human participants, then you must include a copy of the consent statement or the language that you use to get informed consent or informed assent, because that is one of the things that USAID will look at when they review your submission. So with that, I think we'll get to our first quiz question. Okay, so here is our first question for you. So on the screen, you will see a typical consent statement that is used for an education data collection activity. So in this case, someone is asking permission, getting consent from the school principal in order to collect data in their school. So our question to you is, what language is missing from this statement in order to meet DDL guidelines? So now we're going to give you about 5 minutes. Go ahead and read the statement that you see on your screen, and then go ahead, open up that roadmap, and then see if you can find the answer to this question in your roadmap. Once you have your answer, I believe in a moment, we will be putting up instructions on Mentimeter on how to submit your answer. So again, we're going to give you about 5 minutes. Look through the roadmap for your answer, and then you can go ahead and share it with us once that Mentimeter window pops up. And with that, I think I'll go ahead and let you get started. Okay, so it looks like we're getting some really great answers here. So again, as you're reading through the roadmap and you have your answer, go ahead and submit on www.menti.com. Use the code on the screen there, and you should be able to submit your answer. If you're having difficulty accessing the roadmap, I believe we also, again, posted a link to it in the chat box. And if you also go to edulinks.com and just search for DDL roadmap, that should come up for you as well, and you can just go ahead and open it up from there. So it looks like lots of answers here. Missing children's assent, how the data will be used, what data is being collected, and how it will be used and shared. So go ahead and just give folks a couple more moments. And I see we're also getting some questions in the group chat. So right after this, we will have a mini Q&A just to talk about questions about consent, at which point you can go ahead and type those questions into the Zoom chat, and our colleagues from USAID will help us answer them. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead, before we move on to the answer, just again, looks like we're getting some great responses here. And that's great. So hopefully you're able to kind of find that information in the roadmap. I think, let's see, so the language does not tell participants how the study will be used, doesn't clarify who will have access to the data, how the data will be used and shared, missing consent from parents, missing the person to contact in case of need, and again, missing students' consent, children's assent, the fact that participation is voluntary. So lots of kind of different answers here, which is great. Let's go ahead and move on to the answer and see what we have. So part of the reason maybe why there are multiple answers is that I didn't do such a great job with the question. But so the answer that we were kind of thinking is that, which some of you, quite a bit of you caught as well, is that it's missing how the data will be used. So in this case, it's missing kind of a language explaining whether you intend to share the data with others outside of your team, and whether you intend to share the data specifically in a data repository such as the DDL. So if you are going to be submitting data to the DDL, very important to explain to participants that that is what you are doing, and that is how the data will be used, that secondary users will be able to access the DDL and use your data for research purposes or whatnot. Now, some of the other problems that people pointed out, missing children's assent, that's certainly, I guess I was kind of thinking when I created this that that might have been a separate consent statement, and so I was kind of thinking about issues with this particular consent statement. But that's actually a great kind of lead into the Q&A. So I believe Erica Hawkins has joined us, so that's great. Erica is our legal expert on privacy from Data Services. So she has joined us, so very warm welcome to Erica. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and open up the Q&A. So if you have any questions about consent in particular, about the quiz question, or about consent in general, go ahead and type those questions into your Zoom chat. If you have other questions about other topics, just hold on to them, because we will get to that in the main Q&A. But for now, any questions you have about consent, including the quiz question, go ahead and type them in now, and we will take a moment to answer them. Okay, so it looks like we do have a question already. The question is, if consent was obtained over the phone, should I just submit the script? Yes, so if you used verbal consent, just go ahead and include the language that was used to obtain that consent when you submit to the DDL. And in the roadmap, we have instructions for how to include that documentation. So it looks like another question is, in a context similar to the question, when consent is being collected from principals, is it expected to get both assent from children and additional consent from parents? That's a great question. And again, that maybe might have been my fault for not kind of explaining the question very well. But I'm wondering if Erica has joined us. Erica,
Hi,
would
Adam.
you?
Hi, I'm on the call.
Hi, Erica. Great. Would you mind answering that question, when you need to get consent from parents or assent from children?
Mm-hmm. So that is a great question, and much of the answer is going to be it depends. It depends on where you're collecting the information and what you agree with the Ministry of Education. It also depends on the types of questions you're going to be asking. Are you going to be asking questions about the children's families? Are you going to be asking about income? Are you going to be asking about what happens at home? What languages they speak at home? Like where their parents are from? If you're going to be collecting information like that, I would definitely recommend or say that you need parental consent, because now you're talking about questions that are not necessarily questions that are related to normal educational activities. So you're kind of expanding the scope of what the assessment is. And so I would say, most of these will go under IRB review. And so you need to, when you present those questions, your questionnaire to the IRB, and you present your consent procedure to the IRB will also be providing guidance. And so if the IRB determines for the study that certain forms of consent are required or that they can be waived, then you could submit that IRB documentation with the data set.
Great, thank you so much, Erica.
Do you want me to go down? I was gonna say, do you want me to go down and answer other questions that have popped up, or?
Yeah, well, sure. Let's see. Well, some of them, I think I should be okay. So, but yeah, let's see what other questions we have here. So, if the consent statement is given in other languages, does the DDL require English translation? And I believe that yes, so we do ask that if the consent statement could be provided in English. Usually, I found that oftentimes there's like an original English version. So if you can just submit that, you don't need to kind of back translate if it's been translated into another language. But if there is kind of an English original version, we do ask that that consent language be in English. And let's see what else we have here. Does the consent we get from teachers be enough with regards to the assent of children? So yes, Erica, thank you so much. If you want to go ahead and help us answer that question as well.
So generally the answer is no. You need consent from the parent to interview the child. There are going to be certain rules or laws in other regions that might govern and might be applicable to your study. So even in that context, I would always say to check what the local laws are and check with the Ministry of Education. Most of the time it's just about planning and sending those consent notices out to the homes before you get to the school, and when it's feasible. So generally, no, consent from the teacher is not going to be enough, because the teacher can't give you consent to collect information about the child's family.
Great, thank you. And I think that also applies to the next question. Who is the adult who gives initial consent at the school, the director or the teacher?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so if, sorry, yes.
Generally, I was going to say generally it's listed like as a head teacher, right, on who gives you consent to come into the school to administer the survey. But, generally the director or head teacher is giving you direction to conduct your study at the school. And unless, local laws apply and you've gone through the procedures with the Ministry of Health, Education, who says that it's okay to get consent from the director or head teacher in lieu of parental consent, because in some localities, a director or a teacher can act as a guardian in some circumstances or in some situations, but you would need to make sure of that. But generally, you would need to get parental consent, only because these are not generally, most of the surveys that we see are not considered exempt because they ask questions that are outside of the scope of normal reading and math testing. They ask about other personal information.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erica. I think we have another related question. So typically we ask students questions about home environment. Are there books in home, for example? Does that mean we need to get parental consent?
So like if we were talking about, is this a question that's isolated without other questions about the child's home environment or assets within their home, I would say it depends. We would look at the questionnaire, and if that was like the only question and it was pretty much about whether or not the child had books at home to read at home and not necessarily what we were trying to determine what level of education the parents had or what other assets were in the home, then it might be something that we could get a waiver for. But generally, if you're going to ask questions that have anything to do with the child's family and personal income, assets, facilities at home, we would ask for you to get the parental consent for that.
Okay, thank you so much, Erica. Thank you for answering those questions. So unfortunately, we're a bit out of time, so we're going to go ahead and move on. If you still have questions about consent, we will have time in the main Q&A session in the second half of our time today to answer your questions there. But I think with that, we'll go ahead and go on to the next topic, which is how to treat personally identifiable information, or PII. So, and again, another important issue, when you're collecting data is respecting people's privacy, respecting the privacy of the individuals who are participating in your data collection activity. So when we're talking about PII, we're talking about two different types of information. The first is what are called direct identifiers. And this is information that would make it very easy to identify someone. So a person's name, for example, or their real life ID number, or their GIS coordinates. And then we also have what are called indirect identifiers. And this is information that maybe could not identify someone directly on its own, but when combined with other information could be used to identify an individual. So this is things like a person's age or gender, or smaller geographic divisions such as a town or village. Okay, so with that being said, our question to you is, when you are submitting data to the DDL, how should I treat PII to ensure that my data can be published in the DDL? So this time we're going to give you a multiple choice question. So you have three possible answers. The first is A, you should remove both the direct and the indirect identifiers. Option B is you should remove the direct identifiers. You can include the indirect identifiers, but please specify in your submission which ones are included. And then finally, option C is you can include both the direct and the indirect identifiers, but again, please specify which ones are included. So just like before, we'll give you about 5 minutes to look through the roadmap for the answer. This time, you should see a Zoom poll window pop up. There it is. So this time you can just submit your answer using that poll, and then we'll come back and we will have another mini Q&A. But for now, I'll let you get started. Okay, so I think, looks like just about everyone has voted. So I think we can go ahead and reveal our answer. Okay, so most of you chose B. Remove the direct identifiers. You can include the indirect identifiers, but please specify in your submission which ones are included. And that's correct. So great job to everyone. Just a few points to cover before we get to the mini Q&A. You can go ahead and close that poll window so you can see your screen. So great. So it looks like most people were able to get the correct answer. So yes, please always remove the direct identifiers. So things that make it very easy to identify an individual, such as their name, their address, their real life ID number. Please go ahead and remove that. In the DDL user guide, which we link to in the roadmap, we actually have a list. You can find a list of all of the direct identifiers that should be removed from your submission. And that also applies to schools. So any information that could be used to directly identify a school, like the school name or address or school code, such as EMIS codes, please go ahead and remove that as well. Now, when it comes to indirect identifiers, we actually encourage you to keep that information in your data set. So things like age, gender, geographic subdivisions, that's actually very useful information for analysis, as I'm sure many of you know. That's also sometimes used for survey weighting. So we actually do very much encourage you to keep that information in your data set that you submit to the DDL. What we do ask, though, is that you just indicate when you're registering your data set which of those indirect identifiers are present. And we explain in the roadmap how to do that. The reason why we ask you to do so is because when data services, when they review your submission, they'll actually do an analysis of those indirect identifiers and see whether some combination of that information could be used to reveal the identity of an individual. So they're basically going to assess the privacy risk or the risk of revealing an individual's identity. If they feel that that risk is too high, then the data services team will then go ahead and automatically take some steps to de-identify your data. And at the bottom of the slide there, you'll see some common de-identification strategies, such as using broader categories. So instead of revealing what an individual's exact age is, they may use an age category, such as age 10 through 15, for example. Another option is top or bottom coding, which is replacing the highest or lowest values of a variable with averages. Another option is replacing free responses. So sometimes if you have a survey question, people might inadvertently reveal too much personal information in their response. So you can replace those free responses with a categorical response, for example, and et cetera. So there's lots of other strategies which we explain in more detail in the roadmap. And these are options that you yourself might want to consider if you feel that the privacy risk of your data is too high. You can consider these options as well, but the bottom line is we really do encourage you to include that those indirect identifiers. We do want you to include that in your data because it is actually very useful information for analysis. So with that, I think we will move on to our second mini Q&A. So just like before, if you have a particular question about PII, go ahead and submit into the chat box, and then our colleagues from USAID will help us answer them. Okay, so it looks like we're already getting some questions here. So could the name of the school be the direct or indirect, or will it be subject to the context of the survey? So I believe the name of the school, since it would be used to kind of directly identify the school, you wouldn't really need any other information. That would be considered a direct identifier, and it should be removed from the data that you submit to the DDL. Another question is, you can create a categorical variable under of over grade age. Exactly, yeah. So if you don't want to reveal, individual ages, you can go ahead and just create age brackets or age categories such as under age, over age. That's exactly.
Adam, can I jump in and go back
yes,
to
of
the
course.
question on the number?
Yes.
So the name of the school is actually considered an indirect identifier because it could be used to help identify the individuals. What we mean by direct and indirect identifiers is whether it directly identifies an individual. And so this would be an indirect identifier. You don't necessarily have to remove the name of the schools before you submit it to the DDL, but just know that we won't publish the name of the schools with the survey.
Oh, I see. So, okay. Well, thank you very much, Erica, for correcting me. Okay. So yes. Okay. So Erica, I guess my question to you is, so it would be okay then to include school names, but then you in data services, you would then, I guess, remove that information. So it wouldn't actually be published.
It wouldn't be published, but we don't discourage you from submitting it, because we do want you to give us really granular data sets, because we want to have those available for follow-on activities. So in the event USAID needs to conduct its own study, or if it needs to 5-10 years down the road compare another assessment with this assessment, we want the data to be as granular as we can possibly get it for those purposes. And so although we collect really granular data, we don't publish the really granular data.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for correcting me. Okay, so great. Looks like we have another question here. Let's see. Okay, is there explicit guidance on how near geographic areas need to be to strip, or is this a subjective decision? Erica, do you want to help answer that?
Yeah, sure. Same thing. So the same thing applies here. What we are trying to do when you submit the data to the DDL is make sure that we are not able to directly identify the individuals who participated in the survey. But we do want the data to be as useful as possible to the agency, so that they can, conduct follow-on activities, so that they can do their own analysis. And so you can submit that really, really, really low-level granular geographical data. We would, however, when we were getting ready to publish it, we would roll it up probably to like a district level or something like that, before making that data publicly available. But when we're talking about for internal use at AID, we want the data to be as granular as we can possibly get it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess that's the bottom line, is we do want you to include that granular data. And like I said, kind of data services will kind of automatically take steps to de-identify it before publishing it. So thank you so much, Erica, for clarifying that. And let's see, I think we have another question here. So, okay, so I think so. So people think that they don't need to get informed consent if there's no PII, but the data can still include information on human subjects even though there is no PII. So yeah, that's a great point. Anytime you're collecting data on human subjects, getting informed consent is definitely something important that you need to consider. And then let's see, we have another comment here. These data sets also belong to the government, but we typically remove school names before sharing. Are we sharing different data sets? So I guess, per Erica's kind of comment, you should go ahead, you can include those school names in there, so we get that kind of granular data. But then in order to publish them, data services will not actually publish school names, but we do encourage you to actually include that information in that. So hopefully,
and
yes.
I'm not sure if Karen is referring to sharing with downstream entities, or if she's referring to sharing with USAID. But since it is USAID funded data, we should have a right. All of our contracts should be giving us a right to access all of the data that we fund. And so it shouldn't be an issue with sharing it or submitting it to USAID. But are we sharing different data sets with researchers or with the general public than you are submitting, or that you might be sharing with the host government? The answer is probably yes, because you're probably sharing really granular data with the host governments as well. Right. Yeah. So what you're sharing with USAID should not be very different than the Ministry of Health. If you're sharing student names, I'm not sure if you're sharing that level of data with the Ministry of Education. If you're sharing those direct identifiers, that's going to be the difference between the data sets you share with the Ministry of Education and what you share with USAID. But what we share with the public and with research institutions is going to be a different data set than you would provide to the Ministry of Education or to USAID.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Erica. And again, thank you for those great questions. Many thanks to Erica for answering them. This is, as I'm sure everyone can tell, could be a very complicated subject. But again, many thanks to our colleagues from Data Services and Erica for helping us answer them. With that, I think we'll go ahead and close this Q&A session. Again, if you have questions still about this topic or any other topic, we will still have our main Q&A session following the break, which is your chance to answer any and all questions, any and all topics related to the DDL. Before that, though, we're going to take a quick water break. So I believe if you are going to step away, you can use your feedback tools in Zoom to just indicate that you are taking a break. I believe there's a coffee mug icon in the feedback tools just to let us know that you're stepping away. And we'll also ping you when we have 1 minute left in the break, and then ping you again when the break is over, and we will transition to our main Q&A. But for now, a short break.
Welcome back, my friends. Thank you for indicating that you have stepped away from the computer. Once you have returned, I do invite you to go ahead and click that coffee mug icon once more to indicate that you have returned. Over to you, Adam.
Great, thanks, Janina. So welcome back, everyone. Hopefully that was a useful break. We're now going to transition into our main Q&A session. So here we're going to open up the floor to any and all topics you have, questions we didn't get to on the first two topics, or questions on any other topic related to the DDL. We invite you to submit them now. We're going to use a little bit of a different format here. So for this Q&A, we're actually going to share with you a link to a Google webpage. You should see that link at the top of your screen. You should also see it in the chat box. If you click on the link in the chat box, that should take you to the webpage where you can submit your questions that way. You can submit questions anonymously if you prefer, and then we'll actually share those questions one by one on your screen. So again, just click on that link, submit your questions, and our colleagues at Data Services will help us answer them. Okay, I think we can go ahead and move on to our first question, which is, what kind of data is submitted to the DDL? All kinds of surveys, assessments done internally. I think for this question, actually, Chris, can I turn it over to you?
So actually, thanks, Adam, but I was actually thinking about turning it over to either Morgan or Erica on our data services team to address this.
This is Morgan. I'll be happy to jump in. Really, all kinds of data are submitted to the DDL. Any data that results from agency-funded projects. So we've got all kinds of, a real range of data has been submitted and is still coming through. From things like supply chain data for HIV resources to surveys of small farming efforts in different countries under the Feed the Future initiative, to stuff from the Human Capital and Talent Management Department in the agency, looking at hiring trends among USAID staff. So there's really quite a range there. We ask that essentially all microdata be submitted, and the question of publication level will emerge from the submission form and from our review of the data once we get it. But really having it submitted is valuable so that the agency can do that long-term reuse and access and preservation.
All right, thank you so much, Morgan. Let's see, I think we can move on to the next question. Can data sets with over 500 variables be submitted?
I'll take this one too.
Yes, please.
They certainly can be submitted. Unfortunately, there's a limit to the ingest function of the platform. So if you try to ingest, and ingest is sort of a specific term on the DDL. It means that you're submitting your data through a function that reads the data file and makes it available for visualization and other kinds of analysis right there in the platform. Now, if your data set has more than 500 variables, it won't be able to ingest it for those in-platform uses, but we ask that you still include it as an attachment to your data set. And there's room for limitless attachments in the data detail tab of the submission form. So we would just ask that you attach the data set if it's too big to ingest.
Thank you so much, Morgan. And again, in the roadmap and also in the DDL user guide, which we linked in the roadmap, we explain in more detail these different options for uploading your data, including the data ingest feature. Okay, next question. Can you speak to the timeliness of data submissions? Another really great question. Morgan, can I turn that back over to you?
Sure. You know, the word timeliness, my mind's sort of going in two places. One is when we receive data after it's been collected and worked with by the partner or the agency staff, and when we're able to publish the record for the data after it's been curated and reviewed and gone through the clearance process. So in the first question, generally the terms of awards and contracts state when the data should be submitted. And we frequently see an influx of submissions, you know, as the fiscal year ends and as contracts and awards start to wrap up. But we really, you know, hopefully folks will submit their data the sooner the better, because the fresher it is in the team's mind as they do the submission, the more clearly they'll be able to answer the questions on the submission form and to speak with our curation team if there are follow-up questions. As to the publication timeline, it can depend on a few things. The curation team's workload, how many things happen to be coming in. The risk assessment team's workload, who's doing those fine-grained analysis of variables, looking for direct and indirect identifiers. And then the clearance process runs through 4 different offices at the agency. And while we do follow up, you know, consistently, when we're waiting for clearance from those different offices, it can take a while. So generally it tends to take several months for something to, you know, go from submission to publication of the record on the DDL.
Okay, thank you so much, Morgan. Yeah, so again, as Morgan said, it really can vary. So in the roadmap, we kind of have a graphic that kind of explains the different stages for getting that data cleared. But as far as the length of the time, it can really vary. Okay, I think we can move on to the next question. Can an Excel file be submitted, and what format will the system accept to upload a data set? So this one I think I can handle. Please, Morgan, though, feel free to jump in. So we do encourage you to not actually submit an Excel file for a couple of reasons. The first is that if you do upload an Excel file using the data ingest feature, it won't recognize any formulas that you have, so those won't get transferred over. And also, if your Excel file has multiple tabs, only one of those tabs will end up being uploaded into the platform. So we really do encourage you to use CSV files, a CSV file is basically in terms of both uploading the data using the data ingest feature, also attaching it as a separate file if you choose to do that as well. Keeping it in a CSV format is what we most encourage.
Well said. I agree completely. Comma separated values are also a non-proprietary format that is great for preservation purposes, where we won't need to worry about versioning over time and different features that may have been common in past versions of Excel that won't be in the future. So thanks. That was a great answer.
All right. Thank you. Let's go ahead and move on to the next question. All right, so I created my account to access the DDL, but when I try to access public data sets, I always get, you do not have permission to view this data set, or the current user doesn't have access to this resource. How can I access public data sets, or how can I get support on this issue? Morgan, can I turn this back over to you? Sure.
So if you look at the record for any data set on the DDL, you'll see the field proposed access level, and this will say either public, restricted public, or non-public. Public data, things that are listed at the public access level, should have the data set itself available. And it may be a matter of just clicking on the associated record for the data set, but an ingested data set should appear right there on your screen. If the data is restricted, is listed at the restricted public level, we have a request form that you can fill out to ask for access to the data. And you know, we want to ensure, and the form includes language and assurances on this, that the data will be used by researchers who can ensure the safety of the data, and that it won't be redistributed, and that sort of thing. Non-public data, though, is not available for request. So we're still obligated to present a record showing that the agency owns that data, but for a variety of reasons related to privacy and security, we're simply not able to share the data set itself. So look out for that proposed access level field that should describe what you can do there. And for restricted access data, we put a note into the proposed access level comment field that includes the link to the request form.
All right, thank you, Morgan. I think we can move on to our next question. Can you clarify the difference between a data set and a data asset? Great question. I think I can take this one, but Morgan and Lena, please feel free to jump in. So basically a data asset is what we consider kind of as a shell. So it houses different data sets within it. The first thing you need to do when you're submitting a data set, you actually need to create a data asset first to kind of house that data set. Even if you're only submitting a single data set, you should create a data asset first to house that data set. And then that data asset can kind of contain different data sets that are related to each other. So if you have, for example, a data set, one data set is a baseline, another is a midline, you can create a single data asset to kind of house those related data sets. But the data asset is what you create first that acts as kind of a shell to data sets that are related to each other.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there is that once you have created your data asset record, that shell, that collection level information, and clicked submit for review, you can then use the answers that you've given to the form there to populate automatically for your data set, so that you don't have to go through that whole process again. And the way to do that is on the data description tab, which is the first one that comes up after you certify that your data are not classified. There's the option to use a template to populate the metadata there. And then it'll pop up with a list of things that you've already created on the DDL. So you would just select the data asset and say set as parent and use as a template. And that would just populate all of your previous answers. And then all you'd need to do is to change them for any specifics to the data set itself. So if you had a data set that included a survey of students, a survey of teachers, and perhaps test scores, something like that, you would think of that as one data asset that contains 3 different data sets. And you can use those responses to the questions that describe the study in general, and then just add some text to the data set response saying what exactly is in this particular data set, who did you speak to, and what's an overview of the things that you discussed.
Thanks so much, Morgan.
Sure.
This is a good question too about how to organize your data into data sets and data assets. Something that very important to kind of consider from the very beginning is how ultimately you are kind of organize your data, and that's actually a topic that we discuss as well in the roadmap on different options you have as far as organizing your data. So I definitely encourage you to kind of read that as well to kind of get a better idea of how you can approach this issue of organizing your data. So with that, I think we can move on to the Next question. I was under the impression that EGRA data was treated as a private submission. Does USAID now encourage this data to be public? So for this, Chris or Erica, can I hand this over to you?
I'll talk a little bit from the Office of Education point of view, and then Erica, if you'd like to jump in from the data services point of view, that'd be great. Where possible and where context allows, the Office of Education is encouraging the submission of EGRA data to be available for public consumption. We recognize, though, that EGRA data often contains information on human subjects, which doesn't make it widely public, which is why generally we expect data sets to come in at that restricted public level, which would require, as Morgan talked about earlier, for someone to apply to access the data and tell us kind of what they're using their data for. Because we recognize the value of EGRA data for the wider education sector for a variety of different purposes. We also recognize, though, that depending on the context in which you work, depending on how the EGRA data was collected and what's collected within that data may not be suitable for even restricted public access. So we recognize that. But either way, we encourage education data producers like yourselves to submit the data to the DDL, and through that process, tell us what you think in terms of the proposed access level, because we really want to make sure that we're getting as much data as possible to create a solid body of education evidence. And Erica, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think you hit the nail right on the head, Chris.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we can move on to our next question. Can I use the data asset if I collected qualitative and quantitative data? We conducted a RERA assessment in which we collected both, or should I upload as separate submissions? Morgan, can I turn this over to you?
Sure. You know, this sounds like something that might need a little more context to answer, but in general, I think, yes, you could use a single data asset and have several data sets within it, one of which is qualitative and one is quantitative. Now, the policy that directs what's in the DDL, ADS 579, and of course is used to populate the awards and contracts that partners use, specifies that qualitative data can be included, but it should be structured. And we do get a lot of questions about what that means exactly. So just interview text may ordinarily be a Word document or some other, long string of text with just questions and answers. Structured qualitative data may be something where there have been, it's been changed into categorical data in some way, categorized during the analysis process, that sort of thing. And so we'd be really interested in those kinds of responses. And qualitative data, is often treated differently in the clearance process because it can sometimes reveal a lot of PII and might be inappropriate for broader distribution. But I would say, yeah, I think keeping that conceptual connection between the two pieces of the data asset makes a lot of sense.
All right, thank you so much, Morgan. Let's see, I think we can move on to our next question. How can we stay up to date on information about the DDL? Great question. Morgan, can I turn this back over to you?
Well, the data services team produces a newsletter called Data Points, which often has information about the DDL in it. And I believe that can be subscribed to broadly. I would just email dataservices@usaid.gov to ask to be added to the subscription. But I'm fairly certain that that's available both internal to the agency and to partners.
Great. And I'll just add, if you want to stay up to date on a particular submission, you can always email data services. You can also email the DEEP team, myself included. We review the data submissions, and if you have a question about a particular submission, you can just go ahead and ask us, and we can let you know. So I think with that, we can move on to the next question. If we have not submitted yet to the DDL, are we going to submit with backdating, or those that we are going to do in the future?
I would say that really,
question.
Yeah, it is. I'd say that really depends on the terms of the award or contract that you're dealing with. So you may have awards that required submission where you haven't submitted, and that would be something to discuss with the AOR COR. But in general, I think it would be going forward.
And just to add to that, some of you may have noted, both Adam and I have reached out to a number of you around data sets that you submitted under the old SART mechanism and the Ed data mechanism. And that was an initiative out of the Office of Education. We knew we had these data sets. We wanted to transfer them to the DDL, and we were lacking some documentation in order to do that. But to echo what Morgan said, generally what we're looking at is data submissions that you're going to do in the future. And Adam and I, the deep activity in the Office of Education, Adam and I have been working with particular missions and activities as evaluations that as activities close, to ensure that those data sets are submitted to DDL as appropriate.
Great. Thank you, Chris and Morgan. We can go ahead and move on to our next question. I am interested in the basic requirement to include a data management plan that was also referenced in the new versions to ADS 579. Can you please speak to that? Great question. We do mention this briefly in the roadmap, but let's see. Chris, do you want to answer this?
So, as you said, Adam, there is some initial guidance out in terms of what should be included in the data management plan in the roadmap already. And I know that the agency is currently developing a little bit more guidance on what a data management plan could look like for activities. So I don't know if Morgan, if you want to talk to this or can talk to this, but I know that more guidance is coming out from the agency soon on this.
Yeah, I can tell you that there's a working group from folks all over the agency who are digging into this to make sure that data management plan requirements reflect different needs of different functional units. So it's still in the works, and it's under the auspices of the data board, which is the agency's data governance body that was formed late last year. So I don't have any timelines at this point, but I can tell you that this work is still underway.
All right, thank you. So we are kind of running a little bit out of time, but let's see if we can get one or two more questions in. Any question that we don't get to, we can definitely go ahead and send out an FAQ afterwards, responding to any question that we didn't get to during our session today. But let's see if we can get in one or two more. So the next question is, how much detail should be provided in the code book? That's a great question. Morgan or Lena, would you like to respond?
I can respond since I guess Morgan has been a lot already. So ideally the codebook would define all of the variables that are included in your data set or data sets, and you would also have the possible answers to each variable included as well. And then if it's, say, a numeric, binary, textual, etc. sort of answer.
Yeah, that's spot on, Lena. And if there are any sort of abbreviations used in your variable names, those should be defined. Any units of measurement that are used for a specific response to a specific question. If your responses have been coded categorically, we'd want to know what group of answers those responses associate with. So essentially, we want all of the information about the variables that would make it usable by someone in the future who may not have access to the folks who originally did the data collection.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's see, I think we're just going to squeeze in one last question here, then we do need to kind of wrap it up. But okay, so when we submit supporting documentation, for example, consent statements, questionnaires, will all the supporting documentation be published publicly alongside the data set? I believe so. Morgan or Erica, please correct me if I'm wrong. But again, we do encourage you to kind of include that supporting documentation because it is useful for not only USAID to review, but secondary users as well. Code books, very useful. A copy of the questionnaire. So yes, I believe we do publish that. But please, Morgan, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're entirely correct. We do publish that supporting information documentation along with the record.
We may publish a different version, though, than what was submitted. So because we would normally modify the code book so that it is consistent with the modified data set that we're going to make a public file.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that's a great point. Okay. Well, thank you so much. These were really wonderful questions, and many, many thanks to our colleagues at USAID Data Services, Erica, Morgan, and Lena. And Chris as well. Thank you so much. Any question that we didn't get to, as I mentioned, I believe we can go ahead and send out an FAQ afterwards, answering any questions that we did not have a chance to get to. But again, many thanks to you all for your wonderful questions. And thank you for joining us today. So any questions that you still may have that we did not have a chance to get to, please feel free to reach out to Chris or myself. Our contact information is provided here. And I think now I'll just turn it back over to Chris for any final thoughts.
Thanks, Adam. Just to echo what you said earlier, thanks both to the data services team as well as to Deep Activity for putting this resource together. We hope all of you find this resource helpful and informative. Again, as you review, if you have questions or have more specific questions about the data that you're looking at, please let us know. We're happy to direct you, answer the question ourselves, or direct you if we need to. And just as a preview, note that this is hopefully the first in many conversations we're going to have with winning partners moving forward about data in the education space. So look forward to more communication from us on that. And with that, I turn it back over to you, Adam.
Great, thank you, Chris. So we do have one final kind of closing activity, and that is to get your feedback, from you. So we have two different feedback questions. The first is on the slide screen. What did you appreciate most about today's session? And actually, to get your feedback here, you can actually type right onto the screen. If you click on View Options at the top of your screen, you should see the option to annotate. And then you should see a new toolbar with the letter T. If you click on that, and then select anywhere on the image on the slide, you can begin typing, and then click outside of the text box for others to see your response, which will be anonymous. So please go ahead and give us some feedback that way. The second feedback question will be right in the chat box, which is what would you have liked to have seen differently in this session? So for that, you can just type directly into the chat box to answer that. So both ways to give feedback, directly on the screen and in the chat box. Once you have given us your feedback, you're free to exit out of this platform as you would any other browser. And we hope that you have a wonderful day. And